Next up, are the civil service taking control? I'm asking because civil servants who are overseeing arms exports to Israel have requested to cease work immediately. And to make matters worse, a GBNews exclusive has revealed that civil servants in the Home Office are being offered trigger support if they're reminded of past traumas whilst reading about slavery. You couldn't make this up. It's absolutely absurd. I'm going to start with you, Benedict Spence. Trigger support.
Oh, trigger support,
oh, dear.
Slavery. I mean, there are, of course, so many people working in the civil service who are direct victims of slavery because it's, such a recent event. I completely sympathise. No, honestly, it's ridiculous. I think it's one of those things where it's very difficult to know if it's just an excuse not to do any work or if it's one of those things that people talk about fashionable ideas, don't they? It's very fashionable amongst certain circles to be very sort of self-flagellating about being British, about the legacy of the empire. Never mind, the Britain's role in ending the slave trade. That's just by the by. That's water under the bridge. What actually matters is what happened before, what was done in the United States, because this is largely something that has been imported from the United States, the ongoing rhetoric over reparations and slavery. And I just think it's a period over which actually the average person knows very little about broadly. They just know that slavery was bad, that it happened at some point, and therefore we should feel sorry about it. You often hear this, don't you, about how the British government needs to apologise. You hear people saying the British government needs to apologise. They don't know that the British state has already apologised for it, and so that's sort of by the by. They don't know that reparations have been paid in many circumstances. They don't know about much of the history. They just know it was bad and we have to feel bad about it now in the present. It doesn't really affect anybody. And I'm telling you right now, none of this refers to modern-day slavery. Supposedly there are more people in servitude, in bondage across the world today than there ever were during the period of both the North African slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. I suspect this has nothing to do with that. On the subject of arms for Israel, these people should be sacked. It is unacceptable. It is unacceptable for civil servants to be dictating effectively what parts of British foreign policy they will and won't work on based on what they think may or may not be the case. And let's be clear, it really is a may or may not be the case. There has been some legal advice that Britain may be in contravention of certain international laws. Not is, may. And let's be clear, that's because it's a war, and every war involves violations of international human rights law, because that's what happens during wars. They're messy, they're ugly. If you don't like them, don't start them.
Tom?
Where is the evidence that these civil servants are going against British foreign policy? I mean, from what I've read, essentially, their trade union, PCS, that's there to represent their members, has concern about whether or not the legal advice, which the government has not published, the Attorney-General, the highest legal law officer in the land, has not shared with us, the public, what advice the government has had regarding weapons sales. And I think it's important to stress for our viewers and listeners, it's not the UK government that sells arms to Israel. They agree export licences that UK companies. And why I get quite tired of some of these sort of debates is it just seems to me that often what sits behind it is an anti-Israel vibe to essentially stop exports to the companies. Like there's another agenda going on here. But coming back to the civil service, I mean, I'm not in for civil service bashing, not least because they don't have a right to speak out in public in the way that we do, for example, and, of course, the politicians who they serve. Benedict's absolutely right. It's a long-standing convention that civil servants advise, ministers decide. But I would say in the modern world, I think that myth needs to be broken. The idea that the civil service can be completely impartial on these
Why not?
matters. Well, because they have a worldview. I do think, by the way,
Did
there's
we
a solution
vote for them?
for
We
this.
didn't vote for them.
No, we didn't
They
vote
don't
for
have
them, which
to
is
work
why
for
I
civil
think the
service.
answer... Well, what I'd like to see, actually, as I say, we need to blow open this myth of impartiality. It hasn't been around. I was an advisor, political advisor, in the first term Labour government in the Department for Education. What I saw around me was some excellent civil servants, but also civil servants who had an agenda, sometimes against the minister of the day. What I would do is actually introduce the American-style system that when there's a change of administration, those top three echelons, so from the permanent secretary down to the director generals and the directors of policy, those three echelons in the British civil service should be opened up after an election. We have a change of government. They should be appointed by ministers, so there's a direct relationship between the ministers and those appointees. But importantly, our Parliament, the scrutiny committees, should have a role in confirmation hearings so that the backgrounds of these individuals who are being appointed are thoroughly looked into, and if they're not seen to be appropriately with the skill set and the commitment on behalf of the country, then they obviously shouldn't be appointed to those roles.
But the question about the reason why a lot of them didn't want to do anything, they're potentially looking to strike over the Israeli arms, is because they're worried about there being liable, any sort of civil liability, which there won't be, by the way. I mean, because it says the question of criminal liability for a civil service is very unlikely to arise. So,
well, all I will say to that is the Chilcot inquiry. If you look actually back to the Chilcot inquiry, which obviously reported on a war that took place that this country was illegally taken into in 2003, although Chilcot didn't actually look at the legality of it. But one of the things actually that sticks out in that era is that the then Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, to the Labour government should have actually given his legal advice to the Cabinet, and the Cabinet should have taken a decision of whether or not we should have gone into war against a UN Security Council resolution all those years ago. I think there's a very similar situation here. If there is concern that we're breaking international law, why is our highest legal officer not giving the advice to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and actually the Prime Minister being prepared to declassify that information and put it in the public domain?
Benedict?
I think if you were to change that precedent, because actually at the moment there is no precedent that says that legal advice has to be published, then perhaps that would be better. Maybe that would be a lot more helpful if there was more transparency. But under the current system, actually, I don't think that you can therefore have civil servants saying we won't necessarily, we're not prepared to work on something when the evidence isn't out in the public domain. I don't think that they can make that call. And again, this is all on something that I'm going to keep on saying. I know that people like to think that there are easy solutions when it comes to conflicts, and people are going to see this a lot more as this century drags on. Wars are incredibly messy things. People break international laws all the time, and very few people actually get punished throughout them. You better make sure you're on the winning side if you don't want to, if you don't want that to happen. It is, international courts are a tool of the strong to add extra punishment to those that are vanquished. If you are unfortunate enough to be, the average African dictator or in the Balkans or something, yes, maybe you might get sent to the International Criminal Court. But actually, broadly speaking, is Vladimir Putin going to be? No, absolutely not. Is Xi Jinping when China invades Taiwan? No, that's not going to happen. And Benjamin Netanyahu and no member of the Israeli government are ever going to be found guilty by an international court. Maybe in absentia, but it's going to have no actual impact on any of their lives.
Interesting as well, because I don't know whether I read this correctly. I really wanted somebody to reread it, but I thought we actually licensed quite a large amount of arms to Qatar. Is that right? And then the lowest amount...
we sell a lot of arms to the Middle East.
We sell arms to lots of...
So what I'm saying is, my point very briefly,
Yeah.
is that I think it's something like, it's a huge percentage to Qatar, but a tiny percentage to Israel. So even if you think that you're helping by stopping whatever it is to Israel, on the other side, what about Qatar and others who do not follow a lot of the international conventions that we need to follow?
Well, that's my point about gesture politics. And just to put it in perspective, I checked the figures earlier, we export, in terms of Israel's imports of arms from around the world, just 0.01% of Israeli military equipment is provided by this country.
That's
so
right.
I think we have to absolutely get it in perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And the civil service, I don't think they understand the full picture. So I think it's very emotional. And actually, if you're a civil servant, there is a civil servant's code and you're to be impartial. It's as simple as that. If you can't do the job, then don't do the job.